There is nothing so wonderful in the world as telling stories.
Tous les matins, on essaye de traverser le miroir et de regarder le monde différemment.
It is true, I am a woman.
Une fois que ce saut est fait, tout devient possible.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Casiraghi. Welcome to the podcast of Les Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon, a place where we meet to talk about writing, to talk about books. Let's meet women writers who have just taken their first step, the most decisive, the most difficult in the world of literature. How did their vocation call to them? What are their writing rituals? Who reads them and what do they read?
I'm Erica Wagner, and it's my pleasure to introduce Selby Wynn Schwartz and welcome her to Chanel's podcast of Les Rendezvous littéraires Rue Cambon. Selby Wynn Schwartz's aims for her debut, After Sappho, can be plainly stated but are profound. At its heart, the book is about trying to find a shape for your life that hasn't already been prescribed as your inevitable cramped destiny, she has said. Essentially, this is a book about the desire to write your life for yourself, preferably in good company. And who among us wouldn't want to do that? After Sappho is a bold novel told in adventurous chorus. From the Italy of the 1880s to Paris and London in the 1920s, here are fragments of the lives of real women. From the Italian poets Lina Poletti and Sibilla Alaramo, to the American writer and saloniste Nathalie Barney, the painter Romaine Brooks, the iconic Sarah Bernhardt, Isadora Duncan, Nancy Cunard, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, and Radcliffe Hall. A narrative voice pulls us forward in the second person. Someone will remember us, I say, remarks this speaker, even in another time. Real women's lives are woven together and overlap as they create art and have love affairs with each other and argue with their very lives against the misogynist status quo, against the laws and conventions that seek to hold them back. This is a remorselessly gorgeous investigation of the possibilities of existing fully and courageously. It's a book, too, about love and the power of love. As Laura Feigl wrote in The Guardian, After Sappho is a book that's wholly seduced by seduction and that seduces in turn. And that's partly because the sentences, crisply flat yet billowing easily into gorgeous lyricism, feel so easily, casually of our time. The confidence in Schwartz's ventriloquizing of the past sends the reader spinning into the present, even if she herself doesn't look it squarely in the eye. With After Sappho, Selby Wynn Schwartz joined that select band of authors who have been longlisted for the Booker Prize for their debut novel, as she was, in 2022. It was also shortlisted for both the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction, 2023, and a James Tate Black Prize for Fiction in the United Kingdom in 2023. She is also the author of The Bodies of Others, Drag Dances and Their Afterlives, a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in LGBTQ nonfiction. That book won the Sally Baines Prize from the American Society for Theatre Research. Her novella, A Life in Chameleons, just published as we speak, won the Reflex Press Novella Award. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Berkeley, and currently teaches writing at Stanford University. I'm so delighted to be talking to you today, Selby. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm honored and delighted to be here.
So in this first part of our talk, we begin by discussing your vocation as a writer. Tell us a bit about your beginnings. What did you read growing up and first made you want to write? I know you've said of Virginia Woolf, she was the first one who showed me that writing can do this.
Yes, in fact, and the this of the this for me is that, a particular passage where she's describing Dinner Party and the way that light passes through space, which is also the way that the gaze or the thinking passes over a group of people and ripples and hangs in the air. And I just didn't know you could do that until Virginia Woolf. So yes, I read Virginia Woolf quite young and probably never really recovered from that. But I think I started being a writer by being an inveterate reader, a really insatiable and voracious reader. And I went through the whole children's section of my public library when I was little, and then I had nothing else to read, so I went on to the adult section and, sort of started with A, which maybe wasn't the wisest course of reading, but it exposed me to a lot of things. And so I'm a great fan of libraries, particularly public libraries, and the chance to read widely and absorb and explore through books. That was, I think, the way that I became a writer was by first being really a hopeless and inveterate reader.
And that's a very interesting thing to say right now, it seems to me, because there's a lot of discussions around what children should be allowed to read. I put that word allowed in quotes.
Yes.
And obviously you benefited from, just as you say, beginning at A and carrying on.
Yes, well, I'm sure it's evident that I don't believe that keeping books about the possibility of becoming different things should be kept away from children who might become those things and who might want to know, even if they don't become, who are going to live in a world where a glorious diversity of identities and ways of being is part of the world that we're in. And it's absolutely useless and also horrible to deny people the possibility to discover.
Your first book, which I mentioned in the introduction, was non-fiction.
Yes.
What prompted you to shift to fiction for after Sappho? And of course, it's a very particular kind of fiction, so we'll come to that too.
Yes. Well, I suppose it's because I'm a very particular kind of writer, if that's the word for it. It's that I think I'm a very errant writer, and I'm not following a set path where I know what I'm going to do next, or even logically one thing follows from the next. But what happens really is I'm going around in the world having my life, and I fall in love with something, and usually it's something I didn't plan to fall in love with, and often it's something I don't know very much about. And so, but the propulsion of the love is so strong that then I set out to learn everything I can possibly learn about this thing it's like falling in love with a person. You just want to stay up all night and learn everything you possibly know about them, and everything is endlessly fascinating. And then it's only once I've really gathered and accumulated and absorbed and been immersed in whatever the thing is that I've fallen in love with, that I feel like I finally have enough that I can maybe create something of my own in honor of that thing that I have been in love with. And so that's the path of everything that I've written. So even before I wrote the book about drag and dance, I was a medievalist briefly, or for several years. And I wrote a dissertation on Occitan and medieval Italian poetry and performance, particularly about women and the personae of women in Western Europe, performing and creating these forms of poetry. So to switch from that to writing about, mostly 20th century concert dance in drag was kind of a change as well. But it happened because I fell in love with the ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo, and I just wanted to know everything I could know. And from there, it took me, a good decade or more to write my first book. And then I was writing about a dance piece done by a choreographer called Cat Galasso, and it was a piece about the Lumiere brothers, and I didn't know anything about early cinema, so I was teaching myself about early cinema. And in the process of reading a book by Laurent Manoni I think it's called The Archaeology of Cinema, there was a footnote, probably like page 300, footnote 117, about this Italian drag artist who belonged to early cinema, called Leopoldo Fragoli, and that became the next novella I wrote. And while I was reading a lot about Leopoldo Fragoli, then I encountered Sarah Bernhardt. And Sarah Bernhardt, you can't encounter Sarah Bernhardt really without also encountering Eleonora Duse. And when I encountered Eleonora Duse, I encountered Lina Poletti. And then I fell in love. And then it was another hopeless love story.
So it's all these wonderful paths that you go down.
Yes.
But you've noted that your wonderful British publisher, Galley Beggar,
Yes.
helped to encourage you to see After Sappho as a novel.
Oh, more than encouraged.
Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of that process of bringing it into being with them?
Absolutely, yes. Well, this book wouldn't exist without Ellie and Sam, and in so many different ways. Because when I had written the manuscript, I didn't know what to call it. I just was inadequate in my language, and I piled up these big kind of train wrecks of adjectives around it, like I think it's a kind of collective, speculative, reimagined, queer collective, semi-fictional, hybrid genre, experimental. Anyway, this was a pretty terrible pitch letter, I have to say. And but Ellie and Sam read past that, and they read the manuscript, and they reached out to me and said, "Do you know, we might want to publish your novel?" And it was wonderful and also kind of unbelievable to me that they could just have one word for it. And I think that speaks to their extremely generous and expansive understanding of what could be a novel. They're also the press that published Lucy Ellman, for example. So, and it gave me a way to understand what I had made without either just heaping adjectives on top of it or saying what it wasn't, which I also tried to say, well, it's not really historical fiction. Well, it's not really, and yeah, my ways were fairly inadequate, as you can tell. And I think Ellie and Sam just have such a clarity of vision and such a generosity in terms of their understanding of how what shapes a book can take. And then once they accepted the manuscript, they worked very intensively with me to bring it into its full shape. And they could see so many things about how it would appear to other readers and what it needed to sort of fill out, or, I guess in the terms of the novel, to become itself, that I couldn't see. I was too inside of it. And it was a great pleasure to work with them in that process.
Tell us a little bit about Sappho herself and how she inhabits this book, and perhaps too about the Canadian poet and classicist Anne Carson, whose work has been so important to you.
Yes, well, Anne Carson. So I first read Anne Carson some years ago, and the first thing I read of hers was Short Talks, which is one of her older books. And I guess I'm betraying here that I'm sort of an enthusiast and an amateur, but I really am in all those senses, in the the amatory sense of the word. And I thought, I'm not a poet. I'm also not a classicist. But when I read Short Talks, I thought, I want to be able to do that. And I tried, and I failed. So for me, the sad thing is that I'm not Anne Carson. But the lovely thing is that Anne Carson is Anne Carson, and her writing is in the world, and I can read it as a reader, and I can appreciate it. And so in my attempt to sort of write in her form of Short Talks, and in my failure to be able to do that, I started making these little, what Sam and Ellie were calling cascading vignettes, which I think is a very beautiful way to describe it. And Anne Carson, in addition to being, the person who wrote Short Talks, also did the translation, or a translation called If Not Winter, of the poems of Sappho. And that was a foundation and a bedrock for me. I can't read in the original Greek, so I was reading her facing page edition with all of her fantastic notes. For me, that became a kind of anchor text for what I was writing. Sappho, Sappho herself was a poet, and we can assume that most poets don't want their work shredded into tiny bits and dispersed into various, what become archaeological sites. But that's the material history of literature is also part of the history of literature we have. So the fragments of Sappho that remain have acquired a sort of a sense of form that I'm sure they wouldn't have had originally when they were entire poems and entire books of poems and songs. We've lost some of the form that they were produced in, but the thing that fragments gain, and there's maybe an ambivalence here, is the fragment can feel as though it's a loose something that's floating around, that is open to you, that has been broken open just for you to fill it. And there's something a little romantic and perhaps a form of appropriation or something. Yeah, there's an ambivalence I have about that. But on the other hand, it's very useful to have
something
because
possessive almost, because you can take it into yourself.
You can, and you can wrap your ideas around the fragment and then make the fragment look or feel whole. Yeah, as if it were, a shard of pottery and you had glued it back together, but the glue and the configuration of those shards is yours.
That's a wonderful way to think about it. Can you tell us about a few more texts, perhaps, that were significant to you in building this wonderful novel?
Yes, well, I think in general I've been very influenced by people, mostly women, writing about the interiors of lives, whether about the lives of many women, like Aja Jabar's Women of Algiers and Their Apartments is also a kind of collage of lives, of women's lives, very much about interiors. Claire Louise Bennett as well, Danielle Dutton, some more sort of experimental contemporary writing by women. Ijaba Shego's The Color Line, which was translated recently from the Italian, is a sort of also a novel that draws on history and brings lives together in new ways. But in terms of form, as I said, sadly, for me, I'm not a poet, but yeah, trying to imitate Anne Carson and failing, and also the poet Dionne Brand, her book, The Blue Clerk. I just reread and reread in awe. I think she can do things that make me feel like the page is illuminated from within. So in a way, I guess I'm partly inspired by people who are so far ahead of me that I can only barely see what they're doing. But then when I was writing after Sappho, I was also tremendously helped by scholars mostly, and archivists and historians who have done all of this work that I could then build on. And in particular, Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives was very inspiring to me. I mean, she's doing something much more rigorous than I am, but I look up to her and her mode of critical fabulation. There's also a great book by T. Deneen Sharpley Whiting called Bricktop's Paris. That's a series of lives of African-American women in Paris between the wars. That's also partly, she also invents a kind of, there's a part that's autobiography, there's a part that's biography, these little sort of episodes of lives, and then there's a part where she makes her own. And that was, she's a scholar, and I was astonished to find so much creativity already existing in scholarship before I came to it.
Well, I think what you feel as a reader from after Sappho is you feel your scholarship and your deep love of your subject as you're writing across these women's lives, and it gives the reader permission to use their imagination in following these lives.
That would be lovely. I would like that very much if that were true.
That's what I felt reading it anyway. Let's hear a little bit of After Sappho. Will you read something for us?
Yes, I can read the first page. So this is from the prologue. Sappho, circa 630 BCE. The first thing we did was change our names. We were going to be Sappho. Who was Sappho? No one knew, but she had an island. She was garlanded with girls. She could sit down to dine and look straight at the woman she loved, however unhappily. When she sang, everyone said, it was like evening on a riverbank, sinking down into the moss with the sky pouring over you. All of her poems were songs. We read Sappho at school, in classes intended merely to teach poetic metre. Very few of our teachers imagined that they were swelling our veins with cassia and myrrh. In dry voices they went on about the aorist tense, while inside ourselves we felt the leaves of trees shivering in the light, everything dappled, everything trembling. We were so young then that we had never met. In back gardens we read as much as we could, staining our dresses with mud and pine pitch. Some of us were sent by our families to distant schools to be finished, so that we would come to our proper end. But it was not our end. It was barely our beginning. Each one lingered in her own place, searching the fragments of poems for words to say what this was, this feeling that Sappho calls aithousomenon, the way that leaves move when nothing touches them but the afternoon light. At that time we were not called anything, and so we cherished every word, no matter how many centuries dead. Reading of the nocturnal rites of the Panucades, we stayed up all night. The exile of Sappho to Sicily turned our eyes to the sea. We began writing odes to clover blossoms and blushing apples, or painting on canvases that we turned to the wall at the slightest sound of footsteps. A sidelong glance, a half smile, a hand that rested on our arms just above the elbow. We had not yet memorized the lines for these occasions. Or there were only fragments of lines that we could have offered in any case. Of the 9 books of poems written by Sappho, mere shreds of dactyls survive, as in fragment 24c. We live, the opposite, daring.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I next want to talk to you a little bit about your process and your working methods. In our conversation, you talked about the cascading vignettes, as your publisher called them, which make the structure of this novel. They look like conventional chapters, but they're not quite conventional chapters. How did you build this structure for your novel?
Yeah, well, apart from my failure to make short talks after Anne Carson, I also, when I was trying to teach myself about early cinema, and I was writing about the life of Leopoldo Fragoli, I was asking myself what would it look like to make a life, like a biography, in film strips? What would it be like to write a life in short film? So this was one sort of maybe fanciful answer to that question. But also one of the things maybe something large that was different between writing the life of one person, more or less, Leopoldo Fragoli, although he had many characters that he inhabited, and writing many, many lives that were intertwined and overlapped and interbraided, and after Sappho, is that the shape of the circles of mostly women, or people who at that time identified as women, that I was writing about, made overlapping, inter-rippling circles in themselves, and that was a form of linkage between the vignettes, the sections, that isn't exactly linear, and that accorded to me with a kind of temporality that isn't straight time either, that isn't strictly marching forward along a linear line of progress. It's going a bit back and moving, jumping a little forward and then looping around and picking something up, and so the lives and the timeline were both had this kind of rippling or overlapping structure.
You spoke of these ripples, these overlapping circles. Is that what led you toward this second person, this we, as a narrative voice?
In a way, yes. Although also, also maybe two other ideas. One was the idea of the chorus, but not a chorus maybe in the strict classical sense that stands off to the side of the action and laments, but a chorus that would be both active, engaged, like a chorus that would be changed by the actions of the story, if it could be called a story, and also a chorus or a we that begins by being very young, and I would include myself in the chorus in this way, we begin as readers, really as inveterate readers. We're too young to have experiences, and so we find out about the world by reading about it, and that produces the desire to know more and to meet more people that we can understand and resonate with and learn from. And so the we is often looking up to people who in this book are real historical figures. And the we is a kind of amalgamation or composite, not all of for at least the way I imagine it, they're not all the same, but they are a collective. They're together learning. So I think the we, for me, fulfilled those two functions, both being a chorus that is engaged and then also a way of expressing this kind of how do you begin as a group of readers who would like to be able to learn how to write their own lives and maybe even the lives of Lina Poletti.
You lead me on to Lina Poletti, who I was going to ask you about. She's such a wonderful anchor for this book. Can you tell us a little bit about your discovery of her, and perhaps, you mentioned a bit earlier, the paths you took towards all the different lives in this novel?
Yes, well, I wish I could tell you more about Lina Poletti, but sadly, there isn't very much left. There's one book called Gli Occhi Oroci, and then there's some collections of her letters. One of her poems exists still, the Poemetto della Guerra, but I very much wish there were more. And my discovery of Lina Poletti, well, in a way I should have known about her. I read Sibilla Laramo at university, and Sibilla Laramo for a time was involved with Lina Poletti, and I learned about Sibilla Laramo, but I never heard about Lina Poletti. So I only came across her really in this very roundabout way when I was learning about Eleonore Duse, and then I realized that she had also been involved with Lina Poletti. And then I went looking for everything I could find, and I was surprised and saddened that there wasn't more. And I wanted there to be more. And I think in a way, making this book was my way of imagining into the world what I wanted there to already have been about Lina Poletti. And there's, I think, something kind of selfish about that, maybe something kind of childish about it, but maybe also something, I don't know, political, in that Lina Poletti is not the only figure to have been, in my view, unjustly obscured historically or not seen as worth archiving, or whatever it was that happened to her work, to her papers, the ephemera of her life. So that's how I came to Lina Poletti. And then once I had discovered Lina Poletti, she was connected to these figures I did already know, and they were connected to figures, and that's how the interlapping over braided circles began. And sometimes the circles actually ripple back into each other. You go all the way around, and then you realize, who read, or who translated, who was at the same time actually and could have crossed over with.
And your book has an extensive bibliography.
Yes.
Novels don't always have. This gave me a wonderful feeling, almost like I could be a collaborator with you, that you could go forward from this book in all these different directions. It seemed very generous of you to do that. Was that your intention?
Oh, that was a more beautiful way of saying than my intention even was. That's really lovely for me to hear. And I would I would very much like people to go on. I mean, I've only made this little thing that I could make, you know. I have a lot of limits and constraints as a person and as a writer. I wrote the bibliographic note probably because, you know, I did used to be a grad student, and in my other lives I am a scholar, and ethically we're trained to acknowledge those to whom we are indebted. I think a lot in my life about Sarah Ahmed, and she says, you know, citations are feminist bricks. That's how you build. You say, I acknowledge that without the people who came before me in my lineage of thinking, I would not be able to build this. And I feel that way very strongly, that I'm grateful to people who have done work that I can then, you know, learn from, and I would like to acknowledge that. I know that novels don't usually have these long bibliographic notes, but I also felt that I couldn't not say, oh, do you know, this isn't mine, I borrowed this, or this wasn't, I couldn't have made this unless I had this step that was already made by someone else. And if that could allow other people to go on and make their own things beyond what I could make, I would be very, very happy.
You've talked about being a scholar, so you have your scholarly life. I'd love to hear a little bit about your writing routine and how you, I want to say, either integrate or separate your creative writing from your scholarly work.
A little bit of both. I wish it were more regulated. There's a messy integration of life and making, creating, I think. So things permeate that membrane. Maybe I can take this opportunity to say how much I love libraries and librarians and archivists, and how grateful I am that you can go into these spaces, I mean now also into these digital spaces, and just follow your curiosity beyond what you even thought you were going to ask. And that's true for me both as a scholar and as a creative writer, and in a way, that sense of being inquisitive and of having resources that not only allow you to follow your curiosity, but open up, branch out into these other ramifications of things that you didn't even know you were going to ask, and how that leads even to new projects.
I think you're right, not just to celebrate libraries, but also the people who work in them, librarians and archivists. Do you have a first reader? How do you know when something is ready to leave your desk and make its way out into the world?
I do have a first reader, but I have to say I have only learned maybe recently, I should have learned before, that when I finish writing something, the first draft of something, I have a really childish sense of pride and actual perfection. Like, oh, look at that, I've written this thing, it's absolutely perfect, I'm done. And the only thing I want to hear at that moment is, yes, Selby, look, it's absolutely perfect, this thing you just tossed off. It's done, you don't have to do any more work. Look at you. So that, sadly, that's not true. And so only as a grown-up, but a recent grown-up, I've learned that I need to stop between the phase where I think it's done and perfect, which is the moment I have finished writing this first draft of it, and the moment of giving it to any other readers. Because if I want them to help me and to see the piece as it is, then I need to be open to what they're going to say, which is usually not, oh, look, Selby, it's absolutely perfect as it is, even though you just tossed it off 2 minutes ago. So now I make a space between those two moments. I give myself 2 days to be childishly self-satisfied, and then I'm ready to hear actual useful critique.
I think it's worth celebrating finishing something. It's a big achievement, so yeah. I absolutely allow you those 2 days.
Thank you.
Maybe this is an impossible question to answer, but I'm going to try. What was the most challenging aspect of writing after Sappho? Was there something that stands out to you where you thought, I'm not going to get over this obstacle, and then you did?
I don't know if this actually answers your question, but there was a sort of drafting phase in the middle where I went much too fast, although I didn't know it while I was writing. And I kind of piled all these stories on top of each other and then like shot through to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, and then I was done. And I think it was just a picture of my brain working at that time. It wasn't really a form that was readable. So I had to kind of extract myself from that once I could see that's what had happened. I guess, I love to write beginnings. I like the beginnings of things in general. It's also open. You've just started. Things are just unfolding before you. And I find endings are harder for me because you have to pull everything together. And I think some people are very talented at that. They have a plot that's already knit together, or they've got an argument that they're making and they summarize it at the end. And unfortunately, I'm not that kind of person. I have to look at all of the things that have been raveled and then try to pick out which ones to pull together, which threads to knot. And it's not a talent I particularly have, so it's more of a struggle for me at the end than at the beginning.
In the next section of our talk, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the reception of this novel and what happened to it and to you when it did go out into the world. I wonder what the response to this book has meant to you. As I said in my introduction, it was longlisted for the Booker Prize, which I'm thinking must have been a rather fine thing.
Yes, also a tremendous shock. Yes, when Sam, my editor, Sam from Galley Beggar, called me, he said, "Hello, Selby, can you sit down right now?" And I was crossing one of the big boulevards in Paris, actually, and I thought I looked both ways in the middle of 5 lanes of traffic and I said, "Sam, I don't think I can really sit down right now." But he really wanted to make sure that I didn't just collapse from the shock. We were both so astonished. So yes, it was really unbelievable to me, and it took me. I don't know if I've still really absorbed that idea that has happened. But one thing that I felt like I was able to absorb, because it was at such a personal and moving level, was when there was the book launch in London. I went round with Ellie, my editor, to the many bookshops and to sign copies in their back rooms. And I thought what we would do is I brought my pen. I thought we would go into the back room of some bookshop, with like a disused computer, and I would move over a little dusty stack of books and scribble away in the corner for half an hour and then leave through the back door. And more often, I met the booksellers, and a lot of them had read it, and they wanted to tell me things about what it had meant to them, or they had read it and they had given it to their flatmates, and they wanted to tell me what their flatmates wanted to tell me. And it meant a lot to me that these booksellers wanted to tell me they didn't really want to ask me things about it, which was great. I was much happier to just hear that it had meant anything to them, and that they had something to say to me back about that. And that was very moving for me.
That's beautiful. And perhaps that answers my next question, but I'll try anyway, because I was just so struck about the way in which this book is filled with stories of women taking new names and new identities, creating and transforming themselves in a world that's trying to refuse their autonomy.
Yeah.
What kind of specific responses have you got to that? That was so inspiring to me, that we can make ourselves as we wish to be.
Yes, well, in a way, it has been. There's a discouraging side to it, which is like when my book came out, and in the US, it was the end of Roe v. Wade, for example, and people started saying to me, "Oh, it's amazing. Your book is so relevant. It's so timely." And I thought, I so deeply, profoundly wish that my book were not relevant and timely. I wish people would say to me, your book is so outdated, we don't have to fight for those things anymore. I wish people would say to me, oh, how quaint and archaic your book is. It's so funny how we used to have those fights for, gender rights and reproductive justice and bodily autonomy and freedom from sexual violence. Those were the old days, weren't they? And obviously...
Here we are.
And so that's a sad compliment, I guess, to receive. I hope the less discouraging part is that, when I imagine Lina Poletti, and this is the selfish part of my book, I think, is I imagined the Lina Poletti that I wanted, and I want there to be a Lina Poletti who is still with us, who, I'm a great fan of contemporary transfeminist organizations like Ni Una Menos and Las Tesis and Non Una Di Meno. And I think about, when we go down into the streets, like you say in Italian, scendiamo in piazza, quando scendiamo in piazza, I imagine Lina Poletti as with us, as alive with us, as one of her lives is that here she is, in her Black Lives Matter t-shirt and her trans-inclusive rainbow flag, chanting with us. And I put into my book some of the lines from Non Una Di Meno chants that are being chanted in the streets right now, because, it's very clear. It's not over. These fights are not over. And so I think, for me, we need not just allies, but also beacons, I guess. And I think that's what Lina Poletti is to me, a kind of beacon.
That's a wonderful way to put it. And this question perhaps connects to what you were just saying, because we see in this book how gay women's stories particularly are rendered invisible or are dismissed or worse. How do you perceive the landscape for those stories now?
Well, hopefully the world of stories is more open to all different kinds of stories across specters of gender and sexuality and race and national origin and language and disability. I would like that to continue to happen as quickly as possible. I think, I wrote a piece in which women had the chance to be at the center for a minute. I took almost all of the men out of the history. That's one of the things that makes it not historical fiction. I just took them out.
Mm-hmm.
Except for Oscar Wilde, sort of. And I think I thought about Elena Ferrante, who says some things about, just making a space, not to essentialize the category of women, not to say that somehow this essential category of women is better or any of those things, but just to make a space where people who have historically not had their stories told can take up the center of the stage for a minute. I always think of it as like they can think for themselves, like without all the noise of having to be the wife of somebody, having to be the secretary of somebody, having to have been influenced, of course, by Gabriele D'Annunzio. I've got a real chip on my shoulder, I think, about Gabriele D'Annunzio. So he was the first one I took out. But I think, I guess I can say in particular about women and queer stories. I'm a bi woman. It's important to me, not that my story be the only story, and not that I can tell all of the stories there are to tell, but that stories that haven't been seen even as worth including, let's say 100 years ago in the histories, in the tellings, that those have space to breathe.
That's a wonderful note to begin to end on as we draw to our close, because what we do at the end of these conversations is we have a few questions, which we always ask all of our guests. So I'm going to put those to you now. The first thing is, what is the most surprising thing you've learned from being a writer?
I was so surprised when I got that first note from Ellie from Galley Beggar that said, we might want to publish your novel. Not only because it had the word novel, but it was just astonishing to me that, I thought my mum would read this manuscript and my little circle, people already love me. I didn't seem possible to me that people who didn't know me would be interested, and it's still a little astonishing to me.
I love that astonishment. We're going to keep with the theme of surprise. What would people be surprised to learn about you?
Well, in one of my lives, I used to be a medievalist, and in that time, for a little while, I don't think people would be surprised that I used to be a medievalist. I'm interested in, obscure things, but in that time, for a little while, I lived in Rome, and I was going every day to the archives in the Vatican Library to work on manuscripts that are held there. And I think what maybe would surprise people who haven't been in that, inner library of the Vatican archives is that there's a bar inside. And I have been to that bar, and they actually have excellent panini. And I think that might be surprising.
That's very good information to have. Aside from the panini in the Vatican, what is your idea of perfect happiness?
Well, I can't say the Vatican is my idea of perfect happiness. When you first said that, I thought, well, it's that moment when you get into that first moment when you get into the sea. But actually, I am a little bit, you say in French, frileuse, like I'm a little cold all the time. So it's not the first moment, because the first moment I'm really cold. But the second moment when you get into the sea and you can just, you just go underwater in the sea and the whole world sort of goes away while you're underwater. It makes me very happy.
I like that. What advice would you give to anyone who wants to express their creativity?
Oh, well, I don't think anyone needs my permission. Hopefully, everybody doesn't need my permission or anyone else's to express their creativity. But I hope that everyone who is drawn to that will, because, the world that we're in needs so much more creativity and making and putting of beautiful and important things into the world, and so much less making of hatred and violence.
In one word, how would you like to be remembered as a writer?
This made me wonder if there really are writers who have the gift of summing themselves up in one word. I don't. I would need a phrase, but one of the phrases that I say a lot in my life and is said to me often is the Italian phrase, non si sa mai, which means one never knows. It is impossible to know. It's unknowable. And I say that a lot.
I like that. I think that's I might adopt that.
It's yours.
Our final question. Your next book, A Life in Chameleons, has just appeared, and it's described as a novella. It won a prize as a novella. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what you then hope to do next?
Well, again, I didn't know it was going to be a novella, but what I thought of it was, how could I write a life in film strips? That's what I thought it was. So it's the life of Leopoldo Fregoli and some of the people around him told in film strips. So it's sort of a history of this age of performance at the turn of the century, moving into early cinema. And he was a trasformista, quick change artist. So it's full of quick changes. And it looks like it's going to be the life of Leopoldo Fregoli. And actually it turns out to be the life of the woman who has always been kept in his shadow. I guess I can say that.
Very good.
Yes. And the next thing, well, as I said, I never know what the next thing is going to be. And I've just begun to sort of journey along the very winding path of research. So right now I'm reading a lot about more things I know nothing about, the microbenthic community and macroalgae. So those are new. And pig iron, that's another thing I'm just learning about. So I don't know what it's going to become, but it's so joyous to be in the process of research.
Well, we absolutely look forward to discovering where that leads. Thank you so much, Selby Wynn Schwartz, for joining us on the Rendezvous Littéraire podcast. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I hope we have the chance to talk again soon. I can't wait to read what comes next. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Rendezvous littéraire Rue Cambon podcast. To discover more about it, you will find images, links, and references on the Chanel website. À bientôt!